Welcome to BergKnifemaking.com. Today we're going to take a look at making a Tiki themed knife. Now this particular video is not about carving the scales. It's really about building the knife. Now this knife actually came about. My father had carved a Tiki out of a short piece of a telephone pole and had it in our garden as I was growing up. I saw this guy post these carved concrete tikis. Andrew Bebbington did this on a carving page. I wrote to him and he was kind enough to allow me to kind of duplicate his design as knife scales. So the combination of seeing these and reminding me of my father's Tiki inspired this build. Now I attempted to carve Tiki scales with a little Dremel grinder, not very successful. So I contacted my friend over at Rama Bali Carving in Indonesia, and he made up a set of scales out of redwood and shipped them to me. I've used him several times in the past on other projects. Always does a great job. The blade itself is AEBL stainless steel, 3/16 thick. I designed it to be spear-shaped, kind of to go along with the theme of the Tiki. I profiled the blade just on my Origin Blade Maker 2x72 belt grinder using a 36 grit belt. You can see I have a new spark collector underneath my new dust collecting system. I did a whole video on that setup, which attaches pretty easily to the 2x72. Now, with these scales, they're not flat on both sides. They have a bunch of little notches. So pre-heat treating, I left the handle area a little bit large. And I figure I'll take that into size after heat treating. I have a surface grinding attachment to the 2x72, so I just made sure that the blade was completely flat on both sides. Then I went back and took a look at the scales again. Now, unfortunately, these scales are going to be a little bit difficult to work with because of those notches and the fact that the left scale doesn't match the right scale completely. So if you see the lines going across, they don't match. And that's going to really kind of stand out on the finished product. Even when you put a blade in between, you can see that those grooves, don't match up. So anyway, what I came up with, I think I'm going to, when I etch the blade, I'm going to also etch the handle area, and I'm going to leave the etched texture on the metal and kind of let it stick out and not groove the handle area to match the scales perfectly, because that would be impossible. This side doesn't match. So I went back to the grinder. This particular ruler happens to be the exact width of the scales. I just used that as a guide. I taped it on, and very carefully I'm just grinding exactly to that width. The plan here is then to heat treat, and then after heat treating to etch with a nice texture, and then lay the scales on top of that, and hopefully it'll look good. Before heat treating, you always want to drill your pinholes. In this case, I'm also drilling some additional holes for lightening and also for additional adhesion from the epoxy. These scales are not going to have pins that go all the way through. They're going to have hidden pins or a short pin. I also use a chamfering tool just to break the burr on each one of those holes. It's a very, very quick process. And then before I start grinding the bevels, I use Dyken Blue, and I scribe 2 lines called railroad tracks. And that's going to be the visual reference I use for grinding the bevels, so I know how deep to go. The concept on this blade was to have a long, swooping, curved plunge line. I only wanted a single-edged blade, not your typical spear. Regular spear, I guess, would be edged on both sides. I didn't want that. So the concept was to have this real curved plunge line. I went to the tilt table bevel grinding jig, which is another attachment that slides right into the 2x72. Jason Northgard and I designed, and we actually manufacture and sell these things. And I started to grind the bevels. So I'm just going to have a single side bevel, almost a flat bevel from one edge to the other, but it's going to have a curved plunge line, and my thought was that I would do some etching on the flat above that plunge line, you know, like a Polynesian type of etching. I thought that might look good. So grinding the bevel, you know, on the tilt table is always pretty easy. In this case, I think I'm using a 60 grit. Problem is, when I laid the handles on it, I just didn't like the way it looked. You know, my whole concept of having that single edge and that curved plunge line, it just did not look good at all. So I went back to the grinder, and I just kind of ground away the other side. I didn't bring it to an edge, I kind of gave it a false edge. And in doing so, I was able to make a straight plunge line straight across. Only problem with that is I didn't like the way that looked either. So third time's a charm. I went back to the belt grinder, and this time I held the blade horizontally. I use a shop magnet, a handled shop magnet, and I ground it just like I do with my chef knives. Full flat bevel. I gave it a little bit of a, you know, I rounded over the tang side a little bit, give it kind of the illusion of a spear tip. And the end result was much more pleasing to my eye. Now this is my touch mark stamp. I always have to remember to do this prior to heat treating. So now the heat treating process with stainless is of course different than it is with high carbon. With stainless you wrap it with tool wrap, and you make as airtight of an envelope as possible. When you're using this stainless wrap, always wear gloves. This stuff will slice you up. It's razor sharp. You really have to crease, double fold and crease all of the edges. And then this will go into a heat treating oven. It's 1950 degrees for 15 minutes. So this is going into the heat treating oven. This is an even heat oven that I have. And then when it comes out, I plate quench it. Now a lot of people use solid plate. I don't. I use tubing, and I have it set up in a clamp. So I can clamp down on this, and that really makes sure that that blade doesn't warp or twist at all. And then I blow compressed air through the grooves to cool it down as quickly as possible. Stainless really isn't all that hard to work with. You know, the main thing is that you have to have you know, plates to quench it, to do the plate quenching, and you need the temperature and time control of a good heat treating oven. After it's cooled, I'll take it out of this clamped plates, and then I have to cut it out of the tool wrap, and then it will go in for a sub-zero quench. Now I just use dry ice for the sub-zero quench. I don't make all that many knives, you know, to make it worthwhile for me to have liquid nitrogen. Sometimes it can be a little tricky to get the blade out of that tool wrap envelope. You let it cool down now to room temperature. And then once it's at room temperature, right into the dry ice. And in this case, I'm just using 2 blocks of dry ice, and I'm sandwiching the blade in between it. There's no particular hold time on this, but you know, typically I'm doing other things around the shop. I'll leave it in there for a half hour or so. After the sub-zero quench and after tempering, you know, in a regular oven, 2 hours at 400 degrees, It's then time to apply the vinyl, the self-adhesive vinyl decals. Now I designed kind of a Polynesian, um, almost like a tattoo type of etched logo or design on here. I'm going to peel the transfer sheet, just a clear transfer sheet that allows me to get the vinyl exactly where I want it on the blade. And then I weed, which means to pull out whatever small pieces of vinyl are still there. So basically anything that's covered with vinyl is going to remain shiny, and all of the exposed areas are going to have an etched texture. This is my electro etching setup. It's just a car battery charger, 12 volts, set at 2 amps. I've got my my metal plate covered with gauze and soaked in a stainless electrolyte solution. I'm going to etch the entire blade for about 3 minutes, and I do this in about 20 or 30-second increments, and I do let it cool in between. You never want the blade to get too hot. If you did, you'd really chance that self-adhesive vinyl losing its adhesion, and then you'd end up with not the best etch. You know, you'd have solution that seeps underneath the vinyl, and it would just look horrible. So you're better off taking your time and doing some cooling in between. You know, maybe do a minute and, you know, in 20 or 30-second increments, and then let it cool a little bit. I also etched the whole handle area, including the sides. Now, once the etching's done, I can peel that self-adhesive vinyl. This is side one. I'll duplicate the whole process on the second side. And I think I used 600 grit sandpaper to clean that up. So this is the blade etching, electro etch. This is a deep etch. You catch your finger on it. You can see the texture on the handle area. So some of that you're going to see. That's why I left the edges all etched, because some of that steel is going to protrude on the sides as well as on the butt end. Now I mentioned before the handles, you know, these are going to be epoxied into place with hidden pins. So the pins are short. I have pre-drilled the holes in both scales. I've inserted the pins. I'm using a good 24-hour 2-part epoxy. I clamped them together. The real pain in the neck about this build was cleaning the epoxy out of each one of those grooves before it dried. It was just a battle. Alcohol, soaked paper towels, alcohol wipes, small knives and tools and pins to get into each one of those little grooves, because otherwise it would ruin the final appearance of the knife. So if I were ever to do this again, I would have Raymond Ballet Carving create scales that were flat on both sides. Now this is a new part of the videos, tricks of the trade, that I'm trying to include on each one of these knife building videos. This particular trick of the trade is involved with profiling your blades. Now, people that profile the blades, you can do this on a bandsaw, and you can do it with a belt grinder. When you're profiling on the belt grinder using a coarse grit belt, that blade gets hot really, really fast. And your fingers are really close to those coarse grit belts, and you're using a decent amount of pressure. There's a chance there for injury, and at the very least, burning your fingers. The trick of the trade is just to use a small scrap of wood as a push stick. Very simple. It gets your fingers away from the heat of the blade, and it also gets your fingers away from the possibility of slipping and grinding your finger rather than the blade. Now back to the build. The final step on the Tiki knife is going to be to just sharpen or create the micro bevel on the edge. I do this on the 2x72. Again, I said I had an Origin blade maker. I start with 120 grit, and I create a burr on both sides of the bevel. Then I go to an 800 grit, and eventually up to a 2000 grit. And I slow the belt down with each belt change. And each time I create a bevel and then flip the bevel and then do the other side. And I've done videos on sharpening knives. The end result is, after you get it down to 2000 grit, the final step is going to be to use a leather belt. And I don't use it under power. I just really use the 2x72 to hold the belt in place against the flat platen. And I stroke the edge, or do that final polishing with the leather belt. And you get a blade that is literally razor sharp. You can just shave the hair on your arm. So this is the finished product, a Tiki themed knife. I hope you enjoyed the video. I ask that if you did, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to this YouTube channel. I'd absolutely love it if you left a comment, and I'd really love it if you were able to share this video. Please join us on our Facebook group, Knives and Knife Making. You can join, you can show pictures of your own build, and you can certainly ask questions. Also, if you get a chance, check out the book that Jason Northgard and I did called Introduction to Knife Making, and that can be found on my website, bergknifemaking.com or amazon.com. Thank you very much.